Imagine a group of fishermen heading out to a river. Their goal was simple: catch enough fish to bring back a respectable haul. But the moment they started pulling in their nets, they realized what they had caught wasn't fish, wasn't even anything ordinary. Their fishing nets dragged up a terrifying secret: a massive, heavy iron cross, and tied to it were the remains of a human being. A shocking and bizarre crime, unlike anything seen before. Who was this crucified man? And why was he bound in such a gruesome way beneath the water? This case puzzled Australia for over 20 years. And now, at the end of this story, I need you to turn on your inner Detective Conan and give me your theories.
Our story today takes us to Sydney, Australia, specifically to August 11th, 1994. There was a fisherman named Mark, along with his crew, all working together on a boat in one of the rivers. Their goal was the same as always: to catch fish, just like they did at the start of every day. From the early morning hours, everything seemed normal, going smoothly as usual. But around midday, when they tried to pull up their fishing nets, they were stunned to find they were dragging up something incredibly heavy. So heavy, in fact, that they were baffled. What could this be? We've never hauled in anything this heavy before. They wondered if maybe they had caught an enormous amount of fish. But no, impossible. It couldn't be that. So they all worked together, straining to pull the net in, heaving and dragging, until they finally managed to get the heavy object up onto their boat. When they saw what it was, they were shocked. The object was wrapped in a black plastic garbage bag. As they tore it open, what they uncovered froze them in horror. Inside the bag was a massive iron cross, and when they removed more of the plastic, they found something they never expected to see. Human remains, bones, a skeleton that clearly belonged to a person. The sight was so terrifying that the fishermen instinctively jumped back, some even considering leaping into the river just to get away from the gruesome discovery on the boat. Their leader, Mark, quickly pulled himself together and called the police to report what they had found. When the authorities arrived and examined the remains tied to the heavy cross, they immediately launched an investigation. The police began searching the entire river area, hoping to find more remains or clues about the victim. But after scouring the surroundings, they found nothing else. The only remains discovered were the ones tied to that iron cross, and it was clear from their condition that they had been submerged underwater for a very long time. The investigators were first and foremost baffled by the idea of finding a human, or more precisely, human remains, bound to that cross. It's one thing to find a body thrown into a river after a murder. That happens. But someone being killed, crucified in this grotesque way, and then dumped. Nothing like that had ever come across their desks before. The very first thing the detectives wanted to know, as is absolutely normal in any case, was the identity of the body in front of them. That's crucial if they hope to solve the case quickly. Once they know who he is, they can contact his family, learn about enemies or recent contacts, find witnesses who last saw him, and follow many other leads. To give the victim a working name for their inquiries, they called him Rackman, a name that came from the way he was found, tied to a frame or cross, and then asked, "Who is Rackman? How did he end up like this? Who did this to him? And why?" The questions multiplied with no easy answers. The first practical step they took to help establish the man's identity was to examine the remains carefully and to inspect the iron cross as well, hoping to find traces, fibers, fingerprints, or anything at all that might help resolve the case.
As for that iron cross, folks, it turned out to be the exact size of the man who had been bound to it. Same height, same width. When they looked at how his hands had been tied, they noticed that the span of the man's arms matched the cross's dimensions exactly, down to the millimeter. That means whoever committed this murder had the cross custom made to fit the victim precisely. On top of that, the iron cross was constructed to be extremely heavy, deliberately so. Whoever tied the victim to it and threw him in the river wanted the weight to hold him underwater forever. It was designed to ensure the body would never resurface. Now, about the remains. After the forensic exam, it became clear the body had been submerged for a very long time, possibly a whole year, so recovering the victim's appearance was nearly impossible. As I said, after about a year underwater, there was nothing left but bones and the skull. Still, the forensic team was able to determine several details. The man's height was about 160 centimeters. His age was estimated between the early 20s and the mid-40s. His teeth were mostly intact except for one missing tooth, and that missing tooth had been lost long before death, maybe years earlier, perhaps due to a filling or extraction, not caused by the killer. They also identified that his hair color had been black from hair fragments found in the same bag. Cause of death appeared to be a very heavy blow to the head. Not a single strike, but several powerful blows. Those fractures on the skull indicated serious brain damage. What the pathologists could not determine, however, was whether he was killed before being crucified or tied to the cross or after. They couldn't tell the sequence for sure. To try to establish an identity, the police brought in a forensic artist to reconstruct the man's face from the skull. The artist sculpted what they believed to be a close approximation of his appearance. Once the reconstruction was complete, the authorities plastered that image everywhere. TV, newspapers, every corner of Australia, hoping that some family member or acquaintance would recognize him and contact the police.
After the reconstructed images spread all over Australia, people began coming up with their own theories. Everyone turning into their own version of Detective Conan. And that's exactly what I'll be asking you to do at the end of this story. The first theory that surfaced was that, since the killer tied the man to a cross and threw him into the river, this was some kind of anti-Christian message. Others argued the opposite, that it wasn't against Christianity at all, but rather a sign of devotion. That the killer had crucified the victim as some twisted form of sacrifice. So one group claimed it was a religious crime, while another insisted it was sectarian. Basically, people were throwing around all sorts of wild ideas. But the police, after watching the chaos of endless speculation, came forward publicly and dismissed all those theories. They said none of that talk mattered without evidence. It was meaningless. Still, one theory stood out among the rest. One that even the police gave some weight to. This became known as the gang theory. People suggested that this crime wasn't committed by a lone killer, but by an organized group. Why? Because the iron cross had been custom-made to fit the victim exactly. And more importantly, it was far too heavy for one person to carry, let alone tie up a body and throw into a river. The sheer logistics of it strongly suggested multiple people working together. This idea convinced the police as well. They began to believe that the perpetrators must have been a gang, acting in coordination to build, move, and dispose of the iron cross with the body attached. Within this gang theory, people speculated further. Maybe the victim had been an informant or undercover police officer about to expose the group.
Or maybe he was a member of a rival gang who had betrayed them. Either way, the theory claimed the gang decided to end his life in a brutal, symbolic fashion.
So, after the police leaned toward the gang theory and grew more convinced by it, they decided to put out a reward of $100,000 for anyone who could provide information about the killer, those behind the crime, or even the motive. Any lead at all that could move the case forward would earn that reward. Over the following years, investigators began suspecting certain individuals who might have been the victim known as Rackman. The first suspect was Joe Biviano. Joe was a drug dealer with deep ties to criminals and gangs, a well-known figure in the underworld. One major reason detectives suspected him was that his height matched the estimated height of Rackman. Another reason was that Joe had disappeared about a year before Rackman's body was discovered. So, what did the investigators do? They went to Joe's family and collected DNA samples to compare with Rackman's remains. Even a partial match would have been enough to confirm suspicion, but after testing, the results showed no connection at all between Joe's family and Rackman. So, Joe was ruled out. Then came the second potential match, Peter Mitrione. Peter had also disappeared before Rackman was found, and rumors at the time claimed he had been murdered by a gang. On the surface, it seemed like a fit, but once detectives dug deeper, they realized Peter was actually much taller than Rackman. Still, just to be thorough, they collected DNA from Peter's family and compared it with Rackman's DNA. The results were clear. Peter's family was not related to Rackman either. Another dead end.
The police then moved on to the third person, a man named Christopher. Christopher was known to be a violent killer and had disappeared 9 years before Rackman was found. Because he was a brutal killer, detectives thought it was possible the victim's death was an act of revenge, that someone Christopher had wronged wanted to get even. So Christopher became a suspect. But before they did anything else, before they even compared Christopher's family DNA to Rackman's, they decided to rule him out as a suspect. I'm not sure why they eliminated him, but they did. Years went by, folks, and the pattern repeated. They suspected someone, then ruled that person out. Suspected another, then excluded them too. Nothing led anywhere. Naturally, as the years passed without any new leads or evidence, the case became a cold case. That situation continued until 24 years after the discovery. Then, in 2018, a new DNA technique emerged that made genetic testing far more accurate and far less prone to error. Nearly error-free compared with older methods. Once this new technology became available, investigators decided to retest Rackman's remains using the improved DNA analysis. In August 2018, the police announced the news everyone had waited 24 years for. They had finally identified the unknown man they had been calling Rackman. So who was Rackman exactly? How did they identify him? And what was his story in the first place?
It turned out that about a year and a half before Rackman was discovered, there was already a man reported missing. Back then, we're talking years before the new DNA technology, police had suspected this man and even took DNA samples from his family to compare with Rackman. The result at that time came back as a zero match, so they dismissed the possibility. But fast forward 24 years later, with the arrival of advanced DNA technology, investigators decided to revisit that same family. They collected new DNA samples and tested them again, and this time,
The results showed a very strong genetic link between the family and Rackman. So the police dug deeper into this family. They asked, "Has anyone ever gone missing from here?" At first, the family said no. Everyone was accounted for, all doing fine. But then they remembered there was one man who had disappeared years earlier and never returned. When the police looked at his records, they realized his characteristics matched Rackman almost perfectly. The height, the age, the dental condition, everything lined up. That man was Max Tanevsky, who had been 37 years old when he vanished. And here's the twist. Max wasn't a police officer, nor an informant, nor even a known criminal or gang member. He was just an ordinary man, but he did have one serious problem. Max was deeply addicted to gambling. This man lived and breathed gambling. He ate gambling, slept gambling, drank gambling. His whole life was gambling. People say he would gather money however he could, and when he couldn't raise enough, he would find a way to get it. After he collected the cash, he'd vanish for days. Because Max kept disappearing like that, his family, friends, and acquaintances were used to it. They expected him back after a day or two. But in January 1993, Max did what he always did. He took a sum of money, disappeared, and, unlike the usual short absences, this time he never came back. Days turned into weeks, and then much longer, and at some point his family realized this disappearance wasn't like the others. They reported him missing to the police because there was no trace of him. From 1993 until 2018, Max's family heard nothing about him until the police announced that Rackman had finally been identified. When investigators confirmed the victim was Max, the question immediately became, who killed him and why? Given Max's history, detectives quickly focused on gambling as the motive. The first theory said Max had been playing with someone dangerous, not an ordinary person, but perhaps a gang member, or even the leader of a criminal group. Max allegedly lost badly to this man and accumulated huge debts he couldn't repay. When he failed to pay, they supposedly caught him, beat him, struck his head many times, tortured him, and then bound him to that heavy iron cross and dumped him in the water, exactly as we described earlier. The second theory suggested that maybe the gang was only threatening Max, beating him to make him return their money. Their intention wasn't actually to kill him, but through the torture and the constant beating, they accidentally killed him. But then the big question comes up. Why was this theory brought up now? Why is it that throughout the entire investigation, they insisted this case was planned and executed with precision, and that the cross was specifically made for Max? But suddenly, they're saying he might have been killed by mistake. Let's understand why they said this. What was known back then is that gangs used to boast about their crimes. If they killed someone, they would brag about it, because that would spread fear among people and demonstrate their power. But in Max's case, there was no boasting, no intimidation, no claiming responsibility, and no declaration like, "Look, we invented a new way of killing someone by crucifying him." On the contrary, whoever carried out this crime wanted to hide it and cover it up. And of course, all of this is just a theory. Another theory that people spread was, forget about gambling, forget about gangs. This was just a normal murder. Max probably had a problem with someone, or maybe got into trouble with a random person on the street, and that person killed him
and wanted to get rid of his body as easily as possible. But this theory is almost impossible. People who supported it were quickly attacked by others who said, "You don't know what you're talking about. How could one person do all this?" The cross was extremely heavy. There's no way a single individual could have managed it. This was the work of a group or a gang. And then comes another theory, one of the most famous ones that spread widely and many people strongly believed in.
And that theory is that the police, or the investigators who were in charge of the case back then, actually knew who committed the crime, but they chose to cover it up. Or perhaps they themselves were corrupt officers. Why did people latch on to this theory? First of all, remember when I told you that the police had once suspected someone, and they took DNA from his family and compared it to Rackman, who we now know was Max? At that time, they announced that the family had absolutely zero connection to him, not even 1%. If they had at least said there was a 5%, 10%, or even 50% match, maybe people would have believed them. But no, they said nothing. Zero connection. Then years later, in 2018, when the new DNA technology came out and new investigators reopened the case, suddenly it turned out that this same family actually was related to Max, and that Rackman was indeed Max himself. So people said, how is it possible that the old investigators missed this entirely, while the new ones proved it beyond doubt? This made many believe that the police or the forensic team back then weren't being truthful. The second reason people clung to this theory is because when Max first disappeared and his family was questioned about his movements, where he went, when they last saw him, all those details, they avoided answering. Even when reporters tried to ask them questions, they seemed evasive, almost as if they were afraid or being threatened. But the bigger question remains, who actually killed Max? Sadly, that's the one thing no one was able to figure out. The only truth uncovered was the identity of the man found underwater, tied to a cross, tortured, and left to rot. He was Max. So now I leave it to you. Which of these theories do you believe? Or do you have a theory of your own? Turn on your inner detective and share it in the comments. And thank you so much for sticking with me to the end of this story. If you enjoyed it, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. We'll see you in the next story. Goodbye.